Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Jams and Tea Film Discussions, where I am joined once again by a friend of the podcast and frequent guest at this point, Zach, for a discussion of another highlight film of 2021 that has kind of come onto both of our radars and left quite an impression to the extent where we basically said, hey, this would be fun to talk about. And we've done videos, well, I haven't, but the channel has done videos on highlighting individual films from 2021 before. Zach and Jake did a fantastic video on their joint sort of favorite film of 2021, Come On, Come On. And so this is kind of going to be a bit more in a sort of similar format where we just kind of overview the movie and talk about why we both agree it's one of the most significant films of 2021. Advance warning, we're going to really kind of dig into the narrative of this movie. We're going to talk about things that happen that will likely be construed by most viewers as spoilers if you haven't seen it. So really, this is a discussion that I think viewers will be better equipped to enjoy and appreciate if you've seen the movie. But just know that if you haven't seen the movie and you're watching at this point, this is something that gets a high recommendation from both of us. So we highly recommend seeking it out and then coming right back to hear what we have to say. If you're not sort of super antsy about spoilers, then whatever, up to you. But that's basically, we're going to be going reasonably in depth in terms of what happens in this movie and the significance of it. So at this point, I think I'll hand over to Zach, because Zach, you were the person who kind of put this movie on my radar to begin with in the first place. What was it about this movie that kind of like attracted your attention? And what is it about the movie that you really respond to? And why have you kind of highlighted it as one of your favorite films of the year?
So this is a movie that hit the festival circuit. I'm struggling to remember. I know it played at Berlinale, and I think that it also played at Cannes. So a lot of my friends that cover film festivals talked about this film. And I wouldn't say that it got mixed receptions. I think that it got strongly positive receptions, although no one really put it on my radar in the same way a movie like Titan got put on my radar by Cannes. You know what I mean? It was a movie that I was aware of. It was a movie that I was aware that people enjoyed, and I was looking forward to seeing it. And I knew that it was based on a Murakami short story. Murakami, Japanese author. Many film fans will probably be aware of his work through the 2018 Lee Chang-dong film Burning, which I know you're a big fan of. Like
one of my favorite films of the decade.
And so that was really, I knew Japanese filmmaker adapting a short story by one of the most storied contemporary Japanese authors. And I went in pretty blind. And I want to talk a little bit about what you were saying with spoilers, because I think that with this film, there's a particular reason to avoid being spoiled. And I also think there's a particular reason why we can't talk about it without spoiling it. And it's because of the nature of the screenwriting. And I love this screenplay. I think it's my favorite screenplay since Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread, all the way back in 2017. And the connection here, and I haven't read the Murakami short story upon which it's based, so I don't know if this is a Hamaguchi thing or a Murakami thing or both. It reminds me quite a bit of a movie that I watched recently that you recommended to me called The Sweet Hereafter by Adam Egoyan, where the structure of the screenplay is based around dispensing information to you one little piece at a time. And so it's very important to watch the movie and let it give you the information at the moments it wants to, in the sequence that it wants to, because what the information that you are given throughout the course of the film does is informs the specific shifting dynamics that exist emotionally and socially between each one of its characters. And it is a style of writing that is meticulously structured, and every single character has a wealth of emotional interior that you see explored through this complex screenplay that reveals information, and then through performance, which is really relevant to this because this story's main character is a stage actor and also a teacher of theatrical acting and a director of theater. And so the entire movie, in terms of its subject matter and its execution, is all about the details that exist within performance, and the performance and the details that make up the performance of our daily lives, particularly in our romantic entanglements. I just said a lot of words because this movie is a lot of things, even though it's somewhat simple. So let's break down the plot just a little bit. What this film is about is a lead character played by a Japanese actor, Hidetoshi Nishijima. I've only ever seen him in the Kiyoshi Kurosawa film Creepy, where he's quite good. And in this film, he's even better. He plays, as I mentioned, a theater actor who, for the duration of the film, we see him in more of an instructor role, in a director role, because he is struggling to perform as an actor because of emotional turmoil that he has gone through in his real life. And he finds it difficult to get on stage and perform with the same level of emotional honesty that he is used to and that he is celebrated for because of this. So because he's moved into an instructor role, he accepts a position to direct a version of the play that made him famous, which is called Uncle Vanya. It is a play by the author Anton Chekhov. Yep. Most people familiar with the literary device of Chekhov's gun. But Anton Chekhov was a storied playwright. I mean, an incredible writer. And a lot of this film revolves around that play and how this unique production that the lead character is directing unpacks that play. And all the while, this character, while he goes to teach at this school, has elected to stay very, 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 very far away from the school because he has a personal tradition of driving and reciting the words of a screenplay. And that's how he rehearses as an actor. However, because he has sustained an eye malady in one of his two eyes, the company has someone driving him back and forth this long distance. And so he fosters a connection over the course of the film with the character who becomes his driver.
Played brilliantly by Toko Miura. So already with that simple plot summary, there's a lot to unpack in terms of what happens in the movie and like what these events tell you about these two characters in particular, and the way in which the sort of focus of the movie sort of not shifts but kind of grows outward to incorporate Watari, and she sort of, her presence gradually increases. I mean, it's notable that she's not even in most of the first hour of the movie. But Kafuku's emotional state and his neuroses with regard to his job, his anxieties with regard to acting are interesting because it also sort of manifests not only in a desire to kind of move away from acting, but also like in the struggle that he has in actually directing this play. He has a very unique sort of method, which his plays have a unique sort of, I mean, I don't know a whole heck about like modern theater, so I don't know if this is a style that is quite common, but or whether it's something that's just like widespread in the countries in Eastern Asia where this is set. But there is a thing where the plays essentially transcend language, and he is casting actors who are speaking various different languages, who are applying their various different languages to the show, and the plays themselves are essentially subtitled above on the stage, sort of above the characters, so that it doesn't necessarily matter what language they're speaking, and to the extent
to the point that the actors cannot understand each other.
Yes.
When there are moments where you see them in rehearsal and 3 or 4 Japanese characters will get together and go, yeah, I just kind of get bored whenever anybody else is talking because I can't understand what they're saying. And that's the stage play, is that not each character is speaking a unique language, but actors are chosen regardless of their native tongues. And so you have a cast that is multilingual. And in fact, I think where you're building, one of the most unique choices in this film is that there is a deaf actor who this director casts in the show.
Yes, the character of Lee Yuna, played brilliantly again by Park Yu-rim, who communicates exclusively in Korean Sign Language or Japanese Sign Language, or sign language of some description. I forget which exactly.
What's unique about the casting of the deaf actor in this particular play is not just that it falls in line with the multilingual representation happening on stage, but because the character within that play is vitally important to the emotion of it, and in fact gives like a extended monologue that ends the play, which is in this film, and it's incredibly powerful. And something that I think is a little bit interesting about it, I've certainly never seen a production like this. You were curious if other productions in other countries were like this. I've never seen one where the actors all have multilingual representation, but the way that they display it with the black screen and the subtitles, I can pretty easily understand how you're meant to access it as an audience member. With a deaf actor, I think there's a little bit of a curious thing because it works incredibly well on film, where you can use blocking, close-ups, and the sound mix to get her kind of emphatic whispers and like the tender way that she'll hold someone. And I somewhat am curious of how that would translate on stage, but at least in terms of this film, her scenes are some of the most powerful in the movie because they speak so much to this underlying theme of things which transcend communication, which I think ties into the central conflict emotionally of the main character, which he's going through, which we've kind of elided to probably avoid giving the biggest spoiler of this film, which happens about 40 minutes into it. So you mentioned already that the driver character in this film doesn't appear until about an hour in. This is a 3-hour movie, although it is one where I would argue that each moment is used excellently. It's a very efficient and gripping film for its entire runtime. And during that first hour, what you're kind of treated to is the protagonist and his wife and their relationship with each other, which is complicated when he finds out that she has been unfaithful to him. And there's this unspoken tension between the two of them because he does not challenge her on this. He does not storm up to her and say, "Why have you done this?" He hides the fact that he knows it, which I think, one, informs so many emotional relationships that you make throughout the film for specific reasons, which we can unpack. And it also speaks to this idea of what people can understand even when you don't speak to them. Because over the course of the film, something that we realize is that she seems to have known that her husband knew and was almost waiting for him to say something. And a lot of this movie to me is about those types of human interactions and connections. And I don't think that it makes any one big broad thesis on them, but it is interested in exploring how specific personalities and other specific personalities either do or do not communicate effectively with each other, which is mirrored in the nature of the unique nature of the multilingual cast of the play. And encoded within the film's ruminations on honesty and connections, things unspoken and spoken, is about 40 minutes into this movie, the main character's wife dies rather unexpectedly. And the rest of the film is, there's a time skip of 2 years after that happens. This is when he begins teaching the class. This is when he's being driven to and from and meets basically the rest of the characters of this film. In a lot of ways, it explores grief, although unlike most movies about grief, it doesn't really spend too much time on the topic. And it's more about how this character lives his life and then little things that come up that reflect the emotions that linger after this has happened. Tyler, when you saw this movie, did you know that it was about grief, or did you have any sort of expectation that that plot twist was, or not twist, that that plot development was coming?
Absolutely not. No, I made a point to watch this movie with absolutely no prior knowledge of what it was about, aside from the general conceit that, you know, that it's this kind of like, you know, driving Miss Daisy sort of thing, except not, you know, like I knew a very superficial understanding of like the broad conceit of the film, but I did not know that it was about grief. And I didn't even really know that it was about theater either, which was fascinating and interesting and allowed the movie to unfold in ways that were quite beautiful to me and quite surprising as well. Like it's weird because it feels like both this intimate sort of character portrait of the central figure and these two women in his life whose, you know, whose involvement in his life have absolutely no overlap, but who kind of affect him in weirdly kind of mirrored ways. So it's about that, but it's also kind of a sort of ensemble sort of theater drama as well, where you have like a number of characters, certainly a 2 or 3 sort of main theatrical performers who you kind of get to know. Like there's an extended sequence where the lead character Kafuku has dinner at the house of the deaf actress, and there's a kind of a sense of kind of an unfolding sort of relationship sort of building there, and a sense that you get throughout the film where he is unable to express or clearly kind of communicate himself until eventually this driver, Vitari, is able to kind of how to describe the way that their relationship develops.
I think the way that their relationship unfolds and develops is unique. It's very patient. It's something that happens over the course of the film and feels incredibly organic to both of them. Neither one of these two people feels like the type that makes a lot of friends in their daily lives. And so the slow and patient process by which they become close with each other is really rewarding. The way that it happens specifically, as I've mentioned, the main character lives a far way from the school. She becomes his driver, and he still does his routine where he listens to taped dialogue and rehearses his lines. Meaningfully, the taped dialogue is spoken by his late wife. And so in a way, this ritual that he had before she was gone now becomes a way of kind of remembering her and commemorating her. And so right away, it's as if he's secretly and privately sharing his grief with this character who patiently drives as she listens to this thing that, I mean, I don't know about you. When I drive, I really love listening to music. I think if I had to listen to 80% of stage play dialogue with bits of it cut out so the guy in the back seat could read, I would lose my mind. And I think that her patience and her professionalism are so much of what endears her to the protagonist. And I think particularly that is the case because there's another main character that we haven't really talked about yet, who is a young actor who the protagonist casts in the lead role of Uncle Vanya, as Uncle Vanya, which is the role that this protagonist kind of made famous by performing it. And this character is he's a Japanese actor. I'm talking about diegetically within the context of the film. He's like a young star actor, television and film actor, who used to work for the main character's wife, who was a screenwriter and was the individual that the protagonist sees her having the affair with, the affair that he never reproached her for. And so a lot of the tension is about, is he going to confront him about this thing? Or is the other kid going to confront him about this thing? And every scene is kind of alive with that dynamic of how these two characters feel about each other and the knowledge that they each have about the other, that the other doesn't necessarily know that they have yet. And the reason that I bring him up here is because this character is really impetuous. He's very driven by his instincts. He's very driven by his passions. And he makes a lot of boneheaded decisions that frustrate the protagonist, who already has reason to kind of feel bad about him. And I think that he almost this actor character drives a lot of the conflict and the events of this plot because he keeps getting himself into trouble. And as he does that more and more, Kafuku becomes even more endeared to his driver, who's like, look how professional she is. I think in a real way, like the contrast of this kid's recklessness and then her kind of like being so put together and so patient and everything that she is really the basis of their emotional connection.
Yeah, I find the decision that the lead character makes of casting this young actor, Takatsuki, as the lead character in the role, like a decision which even Takatsuki questions and seems to come as kind of a surprise, like this, again, this character who has this sort of reckless, sort of impulsive temperament. And there's another line in the film that I think is quite telling as well, where our lead character Kafuku says that he doesn't want to act in a Chekhov play because Chekhov kind of reading Chekhov's lines kind of brings out who you really are, which I think is quite a telling thing for him to say in terms of not only his own feelings about the material and where he's at and the anxiety and the sort of frustration he's experiencing in terms of not having resolved closure with this tragic loss of his wife, but also like his relationship with his actor as well, his lead actor. You never quite get a sense of how Kafuku feels about Takatsuki truly. You never, I don't think, get a clear sense of his the exact emotional place he's in, whether it's pure sort of rage or whether it's kind of like just wanting to
There's room for
understand.
envy, because
Yeah,
this is a stage actor who's this younger actor looks up to him as a talented older stage actor, and he looks up to him because his wife is this great writer who he admires. Like, there's a lot of admiration coming up from this actor, and presumably with that some measure of guilt, because I would argue that you don't really know how he feels about the protagonist either. You can tell that there's respect and a desire to make him happy, make him pleased with you in the way that we often are with our authority figures. But he's a little bit surreptitious, in my opinion, as well, where you just never quite know. But you can project your own emotions onto it, just like you can when you're reading theater dialogue.
yes,
Because you can kind of peel it back and go, so he must be a little angry. He's got to be a little envious of this younger man, like, in just the way that you always are if your partner betrays you. And frustrated with his bad behavior, frustrated because he's not necessarily living up to all of his talent. And then, yeah, he feels like a father in the end to me, or an older brother, like a mentor figure, just like somebody that ultimately ends up wanting the best for this character, which is something that I find very touching, considering how challenging, of course, that relationship would be for all kinds of reasons that are displayed in the film.
yeah, and I think you can isolate all of that to that casting decision, the decision to make this young actor the lead in the play. And I don't think that inherently tells you something directly about that you can easily interpret, but it offers questions, and it makes it more complex, that relationship, or the exact kind of mental state in terms of how these characters feel about each other, that bit more kind of complex and muddy in ways that, like, that colors, I think, every subsequent interaction that the two characters have in the film.
Is, when you talk about the writing, like, that's how everything in this movie is. Every little event colors every other little event when you break it down.
And it culminates with, to me, like the kind of one of the most sort of fundamental scenes of the movie, which is a lengthy car scene in which these two characters are having a conversation explicitly about Kafuku's late wife, and during which a narrative device, which is introduced very early in the film, of the fact that one of the ways in which Kafuku and his wife kind of have an intimate connection and relate to each other is, obviously, they're both creatives, but also, like, as a writer, Kafuku's late wife, one of her methods was to kind of spin sort of improvised stories through the heat of their passionate relations.
It's like post-coital drafting.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the most Murakami. That is the most Murakami part of this story, is that the wife, who is a writer, has sex, and then after sex, that's when she writes. But she doesn't write; she speaks. She does it orally.
It's a collaborative process, right, between those two people,
because it's about memory.
I don't say between her and her husband, but between her and her sexual partner, because, as we come to learn in this quite culminating scene about 2/3 of the way into the movie, there is a story that we see unfolding, that we see Kafuku and his wife sort of improvising to each other early in the film, that has no end until this young actor, Takatsuki, reveals that he has completed the story. The ultimate kind of cucking, really, if you think about it, on a fundamental psychological level. And it's an amazing scene. Like, Zach, what do you think about this scene and the significance of it for that relationship?
It's either the best or second best scene in this film. There's, as the title implies, there's a lot of driving in this movie.
And it's so theatrical. It's such a theatrical scene as well. Like, you have this shot that's held on Takatsuki's face for so long, as he's just kind of like drip feeding like lines of the story. And it's just unreal.
Playing it so vulnerably, where throughout this whole movie, that character, to go very quickly, back to him getting the role of Vanya, there's a lot of different implications. I would say that the way that that character reacts to being given the role of Vanya is he self-destructs, which you could sort of read into the intention of, like, fans of Whiplash. Fletcher puts Neiman out on stage, and the idea is to kind of like let him hang himself with the amount of rope that you give him. And that You could interpret that. This character is desperate for approval. He's desperate for maybe a way to assuage his guilt. We don't know. We're not really entreated to his thoughts in that way. But what we gather from him is this kind of needfulness, and it acts like a exterior layer. And so do all the little ways that he gets into trouble. So then when you see him in the back seat during this scene, he just scrubs that mask off and becomes his most vulnerable self. And there is no dishonesty in his body language. There is no dishonesty in his face. There's no dishonesty in his voice. And that's something that matters a lot in this movie, because a lot of characters don't fully disclose information the way that he is. They withhold bits and pieces of it, as we find the wife does when she tells this story, where she's like, I don't remember the ending. Whoops. Things like that, where they don't disclose every little thing. And I think that the power of what this scene is, the power of that particular shot that you're talking about going on so long, is that you get every little detail. And what I think is powerful about that is that after that scene, you get even more revelations of this nature from other characters to other characters, not about the wife, just personal revelations. You get, after that scene, it's like, okay, let's just open up to each other. Everybody's heard everything now. Let's just get it out there.
That scene, I think, occurs like pretty soon into the final hour of this movie. And then the rest of the final hour of this movie, like the final hour of this movie in general, is just like utterly just unreal. Like it's just completely a complete emotional just exorcism, despite being so like minimally played in a lot of ways. But just to focus and kind of tie up that character of Takatsuki for a second, like as I said before, like Kafuku says that like reading the words of Chekhov like reveals and kind of you can't hide when you're doing that. Like it shows who you really are. And I think that in performing and rehearsing as Vanya, you do kind of get a sense of this character unraveling, of this character's kind of like facades and sort of strengths or displays of strength. Because I think there's an early scene in the second act of the film where he kind of is auditioning, and the way he performs in that audition is quite kind of like violent, and he has like a quite sort of just real sort of masculine energy in the way he interacts with his co-performer in that audition scene. And you get a sense of this kind of alpha male character who gradually, whether you want to say he is undressed by the performance or whether he sort of undresses himself psychologically, to the point where by the time you get to that backseat scene where he's telling this story to Kafuku, it's this complete inverse of where you saw this character earlier in the movie. And it's as though like, within the world of the story, like being in Chekhov's play and reading Chekhov's words has kind of undressed and made this character kind of more vulnerable, to the point that after this sequence, he's essentially removed from the narrative by his own like, poor decision-making, by his own sort of like an inability to control himself, that then thrusts Kafuku into the role that he had that performer fill.
So in terms of the transition between the two characters in the role of Vanya, I think there's something interesting. So we've kind of danced around what this character's troublemaking antics are. Predominantly what he does is he's a womanizer. He sleeps with people. He is particularly in Hot Water. We're talking about the young, not Kafuku, Takatsuku, is in hot water for having slept with an underage actress. And that's sort of the means by which he ended up in this theater school in the first place. And so it's partially that, and it's partially that he gets enraged by paparazzi, by people taking photos of him in the street, which I think is interesting, because what it signposts to me is that he's afraid of being seen vulnerable. He's afraid of being seen at all. He's afraid of his image being, interpreted by people. And in the same way, the reason that Kafuku is afraid to play Vanya is because he's scared to look inside of himself and look inside to find the grief that he's been hiding and find the remorse that he has for not like standing up for himself with his wife, and eventually the guilt that he feels because his wife seems to have some emotional hangups about him doing that. And so it's like they're each in their own way afraid of being seen by someone or being exposed or being vulnerable. And over the course of the film, that kind of destroys one of them And for the other one, it breaks down these emotional walls that he's been building up. And that's really what that last hour is just Kafuku's emotional exterior wall finally crumbling. And this actually happens in tandem with the driver character.
Yeah, I'm just
doing
gonna bring
the
her
same.
back into it. Yeah.
Yeah, after being very taciturn and a listening type of character, we get to know a lot about her. And I have to say, man, like, she's one of my favorite film characters in years. And every character in this film is great. There's like 8 different characters in this that you could really go deep on because there's a lot going on, which, as I say, it's a great screenplay. But her character, oh man, like her entire backstory is really based around her mother. The reason that she's such a good driver is because her mother used to work in the mornings and she would drive her mom to the factory. And the whole bit of that was, my mom would get mad at me and hit me if I didn't drive really, really, really well. And so she becomes this really good driver. But over the course of the film, you find out that her mother, who has passed away, she just had this really complex, emotionally thorny relationship with this person. And so she has a similar type of grief to Kafuku, where she really mourns the loss of this individual, but also has a lot of other complicated feelings percolating up in tandem with that grief.
Yeah, there's an interesting nature to the dynamic of this, only spoken, because we of course never see the relationship between Watari the driver and her mother, but there's this interesting nature to it where the child Watari attaches to a version of her mother who is kind and sweet and almost childlike in herself, that her mother kind of apparently seems to regress into after she is violent to her. And so in a certain sense, like, you get her having had to come to deal with the loss of her mother, for whom which is a loss that she feels responsible for in the same way that Kafuku feels responsible for the death of his wife. They both kind of, in this climactic part of the film, express these feelings that if I had done something differently, they would still be alive. Their death was preventable. And in the case of Watari, I think it's slightly more devastating because she feels that her selfishness is the reason that her mother is not alive.
Her inaction.
Yeah.
Right. Like, she just kind of willfully was like, I'm not going to do anything. In every other film ever made, the character Robin Williams looks at the other character and goes, it's not your fault. And that's great. That's true. That's emotionally profound. What I loved about this movie is they looked at each other and go, you killed your wife. You killed your mom. We're both guilty. And I think that there's something to that thing. There's actually 2 points to make. One of which is emotionally identifying with someone in an honest way, looking at them and saying, you look like shit today, as opposed to you're beautiful and valid, right? Because instead of telling them something that they feel is not true, you tell them something that they feel is true, but you don't judge them and you make them feel okay about it. And the second part of it has to do with theater. It has to do with the fact that in the real world, you're supposed to get over your shit. But in the world of theater, you're supposed to go out on stage and wail for the audience. You're supposed to go bear your burdens openly. And that is what they're doing there in that scene where they reaffirm each other's sense of guilt. They're not literally saying you need to go turn yourself into the police because you are directly responsible for, manslaughter. What they're saying is it's okay that you feel like a piece of shit, because it's okay to be a piece of shit, because you can still be a complete and lovable person, even if you do things that are bad, which I think essentially ties into the conflict of what the protagonist is going through with respect to his wife's infidelity. Because when he speaks about it, he's like, yeah, there's just this part of her that I could never know, and it was deep and mysterious. And the driver kind of dresses him down and goes, I don't think it's that mysterious at all. People can just be inconsistent, and it's not that weird. She can love you and cheat on you, and it's not that complicated. It's not even that challenging to accept that that's true. And I think that those types of things are like emotional truths that I think are very sage, that are utterly uncommon in fiction. Like, fiction does not go to these places because it wants to be more reaffirming than this seems on the surface. But through the process of being the way that this is, I find it so much more emotionally uplifting by the time we get to the cathartic finale of this film.
Yeah, and it also just lends an additional gravity to that whole sequence then being followed by the performance of Uncle Vanya, and that, of course, that famous ending to the play where the character who in this film is played by the deaf actor, intones about like the tenderness and the peace of the rest that goes beyond life, of a kind of like closure essentially that is spoken about in that monologue. Again, I'm not intimately familiar with the source material, so someone who is scholarly on Chekhov could probably school me on that. But that whole way in which that sense of peace and sort of enlightenment is communicated in a way beyond language, in a way through mere gesture, and that kind of feels like a fitting kind of capstone to a movie where this relationship has unfolded very much beyond like what's outwardly spoken until you have that kind of finale. And
to me, the greatest single image that you get in this movie, there's kind of two that are quite similar actually. So the whole bit with this driver character is that she's driving the protagonist's car, which is this really cool Saab that he's very like protective of and that he loves a lot, and that he smokes but he doesn't smoke inside of his car. And the best scene of the film to me is after they've had their little exchanges, they're each smoking in the car and they each put their hands up through the moonroof. And there's so much that is like essentially brilliant filmmaking because it's all just in an image. But in that image, it gives you everything that you're talking about, their unspoken connection that, hey, we're smoking and we're doing it in my car because I trust you and I love you. But we're both also doing it through the moonroof because I respect you and I respect how much you love this car. And like, it's just like this great little bonding moment that has all these different little social signifiers. And I think that we would be remiss to not talk about Hamaguchi's blocking at least a little bit, because it is divine throughout this movie. The way that given positions of characters or a composition will inform you as to a dynamic in an instant is really quite something to behold, because he does it for 3 hours. And so you get this entire kind of visual story unfolding that you can just kind of, oh yeah, okay, I'm following this, I'm following this, I'm following this. And again, this connects to how the film is sort of about transcending the barriers of language. And cinema and cinematic formalism is one of the greatest ways in the world that there is to do that, in my opinion, because you can take a film from any part of the world and communicating it visually. I don't speak Japanese, but I understand this perfectly. It's like a universal language, which is what it's all about.
Yeah, I'm curious what you make of the final scene in this movie, where Watari is essentially, it seems as though she's driving his car, and he isn't there. Like, what do you make of that?
So I make two things of it. The first is that it's a Murakami ending. It's very ambiguous. It's just like the ending of Burning, where you just sort of think about it for hours. You're like, well, it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be this, or it could be that. I think the two main things that you would think are like, one, maybe they're still connected in some way, whether it's romantic or platonic. They are close enough friends that like wherever she's going with this car, she's going to go see him again. I think there's another way to read into it that's, again, he has like this degenerative eye defect that comes up really early in the script and is just kind of like this unspoken. It's not unspoken, it comes up, but it's just a detail of the film. I think that there's a way that you could read into it that like he just can't drive the car anymore. So he's like, I'm bestowing it to you. And I don't think that that has any implication on like whether or not they're still friends or connected or whatever. But I think in true Murakami fashion, the idea is to be ambiguous. It's to give you the sense of like, yeah, I'll never tell, you know. But obviously what it means is that whether they're connected still actively as friends or as lovers or whatever their dynamic is, it took a lot for him to give her that car. It would take a lot for him to give that car to anyone. And so what it communicates, whatever the details, is a connection that is profoundly deep.
Yeah, and it's like the ultimate letting go as well, because that car always was a space where he, in some fashion, was intimate with his wife, because he was communicating with her through the medium of theater, through reading this dialogue together. That was a space where that was such a crucial and important thing for him. and now he essentially seems to he is not inhabiting that space. It's the first time I think that we've seen him not inhabiting that space when we've seen that space.
Yeah.
So yeah,
like just one other person and know him. And
yeah,
I think too that it's letting go, and it's also letting someone else in, right? Letting someone else into that space, and then learning to kind of let go of it yourself and let someone else be part of it and all that.
It's beautifully done because it's so like, it's just such a little kind of detail that the film ends on, that it doesn't like, you know, shove in your face in any kind of like, or try to like, you know, draw out the profundity through any kind of
or draw out the kind of theatrical Hollywood drama where it's like, hey kid, and he tosses her the keys and she catches it on a freeze frame or something. Obviously that is not at all like the tonality of this film, but there's no grand gesture like that. There's no kind of handshake, hug, I love you, here's my car. You just see her with the car.
I'll tell you what, Zach, this movie I think has been shortlisted for the best international film Oscar, and I think it has a decent shot of potentially even winning. And I bet you there's no denying this could possibly get the remake treatment at some point in the future.
Oh God.
And I'm just imagining that when that happens, it'll be 100 minutes long and it will end exactly in that way.
Like with a big gestural, like, oh, I love you, this is so great. It'll be totally Hollywooded. What they should do is get like Hamaguchi to like redirect it if they're going to do that. Have you ever seen any other Hamaguchi movies?
I've seen the one that he also made this year, which is Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, which is sort of an anthology story.
I saw that very recently.
Yeah,
I saw that very recently. What did you think of it?
I know I enjoyed it very much. Like I'm still kind of becoming acquainted with Hamaguchi, and I'm still kind of getting used to the themes and ideas and preoccupations that he has as a director. It's very interesting because these are three stories that are all focused around the interior psychological lives of women. And Drive My Car is obviously, while there are very critical female characters, is essentially the protagonist is male, and essentially you inhabit a world of kind of like masculine processes of grief and stuff like that, and of not processing emotion, all that kind of thing. Whereas in Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, you have these three women who are in these distinctly different, but also quite similar situations where they have to confront their a very important relationship in their lives and their feelings about that relationship and their own sort of identity sexually too. And they're sort of forced to kind of confront that through these sort of like dilemma situations that Hamaguchi puts them into. And they can feel like, some I think are constructed and crafted more organically than others. I think some definitely have a whiff of kind of like sort of narrative artifice that others don't necessarily have as much. But broadly, I thought that they were each individually quite compelling stories. I thought the performances individually were excellent as well. The sequence in the second story in the professor's office will stick with me for a while, just for the power of the performances in that sequence. And also,
are you referring to the monologue or something specific?
The reading of the text in the second story.
Yeah. That's a great moment, obviously. And I think that it kind of ties into Drive My Car a little bit there too, because you have these different dynamics of each one of those characters is sort of in that room under different pretenses. One of them under false pretenses, the other one under very earnest pretenses that because of the other are false. And so like neither one can totally read what the other one's doing. And that is such a cool way to direct dramatic scenes and to write dramatic scenes, which I think Hamaguchi excels at.
That's a thread of all three stories, as well as that there are central characters who are not fully understanding the key people that they're interacting to, and in many ways are acting upon misunderstandings of another person's desires or intentions.
Or misrepresentations as well. In certain situations, there are points when just characters are being dishonest. I think that it has a similar predilection to Drive My Car with the nature of performance. In the second sequence, you have an oral reading of some text. In the third segment, the whole thing is about two people who, over the course of the story, end up kind of acting out roles for another person, for the sake of the other person. And it's in the first one, there's this sort of a character, it's actually quite like driving a car because they're in the back of the car having a little protracted conversation. And one character realizes something but doesn't say it. And so there's always kind of this layer of performance or acting something out that is either not necessarily dishonest, but maybe is more like representative of something, or is meant to be tactful, or is meant to be deceptive. But there's always kind of these layers of performance with each one of those. And what you explore as you go through them is how many layers of performance are you looking at any given time?
Yeah, and you get more information about these individual characters through the things that they do, obviously, but also the things that they choose not to do at any given moment. Like to draw back to what you said kind of at the top of this video, where you were talking about the ways in which Hamaguchi utilizes, like in terms of screenwriting, like this structure where he will sort of parcel out information very selectively that kind of recontextualizes or changes what you thought you knew about a given situation or about a given character. I think that's an exercise that he does very skillfully through the three stories in this, especially the third story, actually, which has really stuck with me. I think is my favorite of the three. Reminded me a lot, like I was already primed to think about this in terms of like Certain Women, which is Kelly Reichardt's film structure.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
And then the third story is kind of like about a sort of like female relationship that has these kind of like layers to it, where you're not exactly sure how one feels about the other 100% at any given time, but they need each other.
And you literally do not know until it is over, because it continuously evolves and changes.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Alison Bechdel, the author? Are you familiar with the Bechdel test? We talked about Chekhov's gun. We talked about Chekhov. So the Bechdel test is like this widely misunderstood thing. The whole bit, it comes from a comic, and two characters are talking about how you can queer code any two female characters if they pass the Bechdel test. And I just thought it was funny because the first segment of Wheel of Fortune fantasy, it's two women in the back of a car, but they're talking about a man, which is the Bechdel test. Once you get to this last part and it's two women talking to each other, it's like it immediately becomes a sapphic thing. I was like, she was right. You can fucking queer code if they pass. It was just a weird moment of like, as soon as it started, I thought about Alison Bechdel. I was like, oh, look, the movie passed the Bechdel test in like a fairly superficial way. And then it immediately became queer. And I was like, yes, let's go.
There's a really funny way as well, like in the very last moments of the whole movie, that Hamaguchi like subverts your expectation there too as well. Where one character kind of like goes to sort of embrace another character, and you have an expectation of a certain thing that's going to happen, and that just is not what happens. There's like
his blocking throughout that segment of like, there's the poster is probably the most impressive shot of the film. It's one character going down an escalator while one character goes up an escalator, and then they kind of like reverse, the other one goes down as the other one comes up, and they're like trying to chase each other through the escalator. But there's multiple moments throughout that segment where like it uses the language of almost like a romance or like a rom-com physically in terms of its blocking to explore a relationship that is not romantic. That's a little bit too much information, but it uses all these different little things that are kind of like subverting these visual ideas within the context of its narrative. I agree, that one stuck with me too. I think the middle one kind of iffy. I like a particular scene of it really well, and then the rest of it's okay. And I thought the first one for me was the most impressive, just because it does this really great little recontextualization trick about halfway through it. And I was like, oh,
yeah.
And so of course, like he puts that right at the beginning, and I was watching the other two thinking that they were going to do similar things, and they're just kind of two different stories. We talked about his gifts as a writer to kind of recontextualize, and I think all three of these segments are well written individually, but I do wish that on some level they kind of fit together a little bit more cohesively. Like, even if thematically, as you went along, different thematic pieces were making previous entries go, oh, okay, and recontextualizing them. And I don't know that that was the intent of this. I don't know if it was ever what Hamaguchi was trying to accomplish, but it's something that I kind of want out of every anthology, and I never really get it. They just always sort of feel like three, like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I still enjoyed the film a great deal.
I think I'm more of a hyperlink guy. I'm more of like an Amoris Paris, like where the three stories end up like that's certain women a little bit, like they converge a little bit, or like Three Colors trilogy.
Three Colors trilogy. I was just going to say, I think it's a good place to wrap up our discussion. But yeah, let us know at home what you think of Drive My Car, whether you enjoyed it as much as we did, whether you had any different theories or ideas about particular characters or themes or things that Hamaguchi is doing with this movie. If you've seen Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy that we also discussed as well, if you have any additional thoughts on that film, let us know as well. If you have thoughts on Hamaguchi more broadly, other movies of his that we should check out too.
Yeah, any recommendations? Because both of us are like, we were both impressed with both of these films, particularly Drive My Car. Where does Drive My Car fall for you on your year-end list?
Oh, I haven't
actually. If you have one, I know that New Zealand releases are a little bit funky.
I haven't formally put it on, but I'd probably put it in the number 2 spot, just behind Memoria and just ahead of Spencer. I think it's about there for me. It's
in my 2 spot, just ahead of Spencer as well. Behind Come On, but
it's like, just right up here.
Watch it.
So that's basically where we're at. We'll be back to do another one of these on topical film at some point in the near future, I am sure. But yeah, let us know. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Recommendations, anything you'd like to see as well, anything you'd like to see us do. Make sure you hop on over to First Watch as well. Zach's podcast is on basically wherever you get your podcast from. You get
Spotify,
podcasts.
Apple, and Anchor.
Yeah, I literally just went on to my podcast Apple app and saved the episodes, because the episodes you've done so far, you've done one on Jackie, which I helped to edit the original cut of. So I've already heard that one. But the other 2 you've done, Licorice Pizza and West Side Story / Tragedy of Macbeth, which both look fucking awesome. I haven't seen any of those movies yet, so I have to watch them first. But I look forward to it.
Yeah.
And on that note, as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Saab. We don't make compromises, we make Saabs.